My new boss didn't lower her voice when she said it. Fire your entire team by Friday. If you don't. I will. She stood in my office like she owned it already, one manicured hand resting on my desk, the other tapping her phone as if 8 people's livelihoods were just calendar reminders. Her name was Marianne Cole, freshly hired as Chief Operations Officer at Averon Dynamics, and she'd been here exactly 23 days. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I just smiled, behind the glass walls. My team was working completely unaware. Ethan hunched over architectural diagrams. Maribel whispered into a headset, calming a frustrated client. Jonah scribbled equations across a whiteboard like he was racing time itself. They looked focused, alive, necessary. They cost too much. Marianne continued flatly. Your unit runs at nearly double the expense of standard operational teams. And frankly, Elise, she leaned closer. Results don't matter if I can't measure them my way. I gripped my pen hard enough to feel it bend. They deserve notice, I said evenly. At least 2 weeks. Friday, she replied. Security will escort them out if needed. Then she walked away, heels clicking with the confidence of someone who thought the story was already over. It wasn't. That night, I opened my desk drawer and touched the handwritten notes my team had given me after we saved the Helios rollout last quarter messages about trust, about finally being seen, about belonging somewhere that usually swallowed people whole. They had no idea what they'd done for this company, and apparently, neither did Marianne, at 7 that evening. I texted one message Greenway Park, 7 sharp. They came. Every one of them. Faces tense, waiting. Our new COO wants you gone by Friday. I told them. Silence spread fast. Shock, anger, confusion. But the Orion launch Maribel started depends entirely on us. Jonah finished quietly. I nodded. She thinks you're replaceable. I said, she thinks you're expensive. She thinks you're invisible. I paused, then met their eyes one by one. What she doesn't know, I said softly, is who you really are. And that was the moment everything changed. Hey, how are you holding up right now? If you've been listening for a while, maybe take a second to sip some warm water or wrap yourself in something cozy. Stories land better when your body feels at ease. Where are you listening from today? If this moment already has you leaning in, consider subscribing so you don't miss what happens next. Some stories unfold quietly, and this one is just getting started. Because what came after that night in the park was something none of us were prepared for. My name is Elise Parker, and 5 years ago, I joined Averon Dynamics as a systems operations lead, one of those titles that sounds important enough to keep people from asking what you actually do. In reality, I was invisible. I didn't present at town halls. I didn't sit near executives. I didn't speak in the language of buzzwords and slides. My job was simpler and harder. I noticed where things broke before anyone admitted they were broken. I kept timelines aligned, people talking, and problems contained before they reached the boardroom. Upper management barely knew my name. What they never noticed was how closely I watched everything. I watched which projects quietly failed and were buried under optimistic reports. I watched which successful launches required frantic overnight fixes by people who never got credit. I watched who stayed late without being asked, who solved problems without titles, who held the company together when leadership only saw numbers. 18 months ago, Averon nearly collapsed. Revenue dropped sharply in 2 quarters. 2 major enterprise clients froze renewals. Panic spread fast, quiet layoffs, rushed restructures, desperate meetings that went nowhere. Executives talked strategy. None of it worked. So I made a proposal. I asked for a small team. No announcement, no press, no new department, just permission to work differently. The CEO at the time, Daniel Roth, stared at me across his desk like I'd just asked to borrow his car without a license. Why, he asked. Because everyone else is trying to fix symptoms. I said, I want to fix causes. Reluctantly. He agreed. I chose people no one else saw as essential. Not stars, not favorites, not names anyone fought to protect. Ethan, who could redesign an entire logistics flow on a whiteboard in silence. Maribel, who remembered every client's history better than our CRM ever could. Jonah, whose models predicted failures months before they showed up in reports. And the others, each overlooked, each underestimated, each quietly brilliant. We worked out of a forgotten conference room with flickering lights and bad coffee, while executives argued in glass towers. We rebuilt processes, repaired relationships, and redesigned systems no one wanted to admit were broken. 6 months later, losses stopped. 10 months later, growth returned. Leadership congratulated itself. We went back to work. Daniel knew what we'd done. He protected us, gave us room, let us operate without interference. Then he retired, and Marianne Cole arrived with her spreadsheets, her reputation, and her talent for cutting things she didn't understand. She never asked what we did. She never asked who depended on us. She never asked why things worked. She only saw cost, standing there in Greenway Park, watching my team absorb the news. I realized something with perfect clarity. Marianne thought she was ending a story. She had no idea she'd just stepped into the middle of one. The next morning, nothing looked different. People still walked into Avern Dynamics with coffee in hand. Elevators still chimed. Meetings still started late and ended without conclusions. From the outside, it was an ordinary week. Inside my team, everything shifted. We didn't protest. We didn't complain. We didn't ask for exceptions. Instead, we followed instructions with almost painful precision. Ethan began documenting his workflows in neutral, clinical language stripped of the intuition that made them work. Maribel transferred client histories into shared systems that had never been able to capture nuance. Jonah handed over forecasting models without the contextual notes that explained why the numbers mattered. To anyone watching, it looked like cooperation. Marianne noticed. She even stopped by my office once, her expression faintly approving. I appreciate professionalism, she said. Some managers make this emotional. I understand business, I replied, sliding a framed photo into a cardboard box. She nodded, satisfied, and walked away. What she didn't see were the gaps forming already. By Wednesday, a regional client escalated a minor issue that normally would have died in Maribel's inbox. Without her quiet intervention, it landed on a director's desk, then bounced to legal, then stalled completely. By Thursday, a supply partner flagged a delay Ethan would have rerouted in minutes. Procurement didn't know who to call. The issue sat unresolved for 6 hours. No fires yet, just smoke. That night, we met again, this time in my apartment. 8 people around a small dining table. Voices low, phones face down. She's mapping authority, not value, Jonah said. She's cutting where she can't trace impact. And she's rushing, Maribel added, which means she's not looking closely. That was the opening. Friday came fast. Exit interviews were scheduled back to back. Security stood nearby, polite but firm. Badges were collected. Access quietly revoked. Marianne sent me a short message before leaving for the day. Clean execution, well handled. I didn't reply. At 5:30, after the building emptied, I made a call. Daniel, I said when the former CEO answered. It's happening. He was quiet for a long moment. Are you sure, he asked? Once we move, there's no reversing it. I'm sure, I said. She doesn't know what she's dismantling, but the board will. Another pause. Monday morning, he said finally. Be ready. The weekend stretched thin and sleepless. I replayed every contingency, every risk. If we were wrong, if Marianne was merely careless, not deliberate, this could collapse back onto us. But by Sunday evening, the pattern was clear. Marianne hadn't eliminated inefficiency. She had removed the people who prevented disaster quietly. And on Monday, The absence she dismissed as savings was about to become visible. Because when systems fail, they don't announce it. They reveal it suddenly, publicly, and all at once. Monday morning exposed everything Marianne had chosen not to see. By 8:15, my inbox was already filling with quiet red flags, requests marked urgent. Questions that normally never reached me. Threads looping without resolution. People were doing their jobs, following process, escalating correctly, and still, nothing moved. At 8:42, operations flagged a mismatch between forecasted output and supplier delivery. It was minor. Normally, Ethan would have rerouted capacity before anyone noticed. Instead, 3 managers argued over responsibility while the clock kept ticking. At 9:10, a long-standing client requested clarification on a contract clause Maribel had negotiated verbally years ago to keep the relationship intact. Legal couldn't find it documented. The client paused renewal discussions until further notice. By 10, Jonah's absence became visible. The weekly performance dashboard updated automatically numbers without interpretation. Executives stared at declining confidence intervals they didn't understand. No commentary, no warnings. Just data. Cold and unexplained. Marianne arrived late. Confident. Carrying a tablet and a smile she hadn't earned yet. Busy morning, she asked lightly as she passed my desk. Very, I said. She took that as validation. At 10:30, the first real break happened. A subsystem tied to the upcoming Orion platform began misbehaving, not failing outright, just behaving inconsistently. Exactly the kind of issue that never triggers alarms until it's too late. Engineering escalated, then product, then compliance. No one could trace ownership, because the ownership had been removed by 11:15. Daniel arrived, not announced, not scheduled. Just there, standing quietly at the back of the executive conference room, as people filtered in for the emergency briefing Marianne hadn't planned to lead. She froze when she saw him. "Daniel," she said, recovering quickly. "This is unexpected." "So are system-wide coordination failures," he replied calmly. "I thought I'd listen." The board call started tense and grew sharper by the minute. Why weren't issues flagged earlier? Why did escalation paths feel fragmented? Why were 3 unrelated problems intersecting at once? Marianne spoke confidently, at first blaming transition noise. Temporary adjustment. Short-term friction from restructuring. Then, a board member asked a question she wasn't ready for. Who previously handled cross-department risk containment? Marianne hesitated. She glanced at her tablet, then at me. Elise managed a specialty unit, she said carefully. But those functions were redundant. Daniel leaned forward slightly. Redundant. He repeated, "Interesting." He turned to the room. 18 months ago. This company was weeks from collapse. That specialty unit prevented it quietly. The reason you don't see their fingerprints is because they fixed problems before you ever felt them. The room went still. Marianne's confidence didn't crack yet, but it thinned. "I wasn't informed of that scope," she said. Daniel met her gaze evenly. "You were informed," he said. "You didn't ask." Silence settled like pressure, and for the first time since she arrived, Marianne realized something fundamental. What she'd cut wasn't excess. It was insulation, and the cold had already started creeping in. The room stayed quiet longer than it should have. Marianne adjusted her posture. Smoothing the front of her blazer-like control was something you could iron back into place. She wasn't panicking yet, but she was recalculating. "I wasn't given full visibility," she said carefully. "My mandate was efficiency. I acted on the information available." Daniel didn't argue. That was the dangerous part. "Then let's improve visibility," he said. "Elise, walk us through what's actually happening this morning." Every eye turned to me. I stood, steady, and connected my laptop to the screen. No drama, no accusations, just facts. At 8:42, supply chain flagged a deviation. I began. It wasn't critical, but it required rerouting capacity across 2 vendors. That decision usually takes 6 minutes. A timeline appeared on the screen. Today, it took 1 hour and 12. Murmurs rippled through the room. At 9:10, a client paused renewal over an undocumented concession. That concession was intentional. It prevented 3 previous disputes. Without context, legal treated it as risk instead of strategy. Another slide, and at 10:30, Orion's subsystem began behaving inconsistently, not failing, just drifting. That's the most dangerous state. It requires judgment, not escalation. I paused. That judgment used to live with my team. Marianne interjected quickly. Those issues are transitional. Short-term friction after restructuring is expected. Agreed, Daniel said calmly. Which is why this next part matters. He nodded to me. I clicked once more. A dependency map filled the screen, dense, layered, unmistakable. Over the last 18 months, I said, my team handled cross-functional risk containment for 42% of active initiatives. Not officially, practically. Someone exhaled sharply. These aren't tasks. I continued. They're relationships, memory, pattern recognition. You don't see them on org charts. Marianne's jaw tightened. So what are you suggesting, she asked? That we reverse a completed decision? No. I said, I'm suggesting we understand the cost of it. Daniel folded his hands. Marianne, he said, did you review this map before ordering the terminations? She hesitated. Just a fraction too long. I reviewed expense reports. She answered. That was the moment, not because of what she said, but because of how quickly she said it. The board didn't miss it. So, you eliminated a unit responsible for nearly half our risk containment. One member said slowly. Without assessing functional impact, I assessed financial impact. Marianne replied. Voice sharpening. Which is my role? Daniel nodded once. And now we're assessing the rest. A notification pinged on the room's main screen. An Orion test environment had auto-paused. Not failed. Paused, waiting for a human decision. No one moved. Marianne looked around, suddenly aware of something she hadn't calculated for. She had removed the people who answered questions before they were asked, and now the system was asking one out loud. No one spoke. The paused Orion environment glowed on the screen like an accusation neutral, patient, unforgiving. It wasn't broken. It was waiting. Marianne cleared her throat. Engineering can handle that, she said. Too quickly. There are protocols. Daniel didn't respond. He looked at the board instead. How long? He asked. Before a paused system becomes a failed one, the head of product answered carefully. Depends on judgment calls. Small ones, timing, context. In other words, Daniel said, people. Marianne's fingers tightened around her tablet. I'm not opposed to people, she said. I'm opposed to inefficiency. I spoke before the tension could harden further. What looks like inefficiency, I said, is often redundancy with purpose. Backup thinking, parallel awareness, the ability to notice when something feels wrong before metrics confirm it. I clicked again. A log appeared time-stamped notes. Short, unremarkable entries. These are micro-interventions. I explained, most never escalate. They don't show up in quarterly reports because success looks like nothing happened. One board member leaned forward. And today, I said, those interventions don't exist. The Orion system remained paused. Marianne shifted in her chair. Then unpause it, she said. Authorize the standard workaround. Jonah's absence was suddenly loud. That workaround, the head of engineering said slowly, assumes conditions that may not hold. Normally we'd ask, he stopped himself. We'd ask Elise's team. Daniel exhaled. So the choice is simple, he said. We either guess, or we bring back the people who know. Marianne shook her head. That undermines the restructuring. You can't reverse decisions every time leadership feels uncomfortable. Daniel turned to her. Calm but firm. This isn't discomfort. This is exposure. The board murmured agreement. Another notification appeared. A client escalation. Then another. Nothing catastrophic. Yet. Marianne looked at me, then not with anger, but with something closer to disbelief. You planned this, she said. No. I replied. I planned for reality. Daniel stood. Here's what's going to happen. He said. Effective immediately. Elise's team will be reinstated under interim strategic authority, access restored, decision-making privileges reinstated. Marianne opened her mouth to object. And, Daniel added, until we complete a full impact review, all operational changes require board visibility. The room was silent again. Marianne nodded slowly, but her eyes were sharp. This isn't over, she said quietly to me as people began standing. I met her gaze. No, I agreed. It isn't. By noon, access was restored, passwords reactivated, systems breathed again. The Orion environment resumed smoothly, quietly, as if nothing had ever been wrong. That afternoon, as I walked past my team's desks, I felt something unfamiliar settle in. Not victory, momentum. Because Marianne hadn't been careless. She had been deliberate. And now that she knew we weren't invisible, I was certain of one thing: she wouldn't make the same mistake twice. The atmosphere changed after Monday. Not loudly, not visibly, but in the way air feels before a storm still. Watchful, charged. Marianne became courteous, almost warm. She asked questions in meetings she had previously dominated. She praised collaboration. She spoke the language of alignment and transparency. I didn't trust a word of it. Attention, when it turns sharp, is more dangerous than neglect. By Tuesday afternoon, Jonah noticed something first. Someone's querying Orion's decision logs outside normal review windows, he said quietly, leaning into my doorway. Read-only access. But selective. Marianne. She wasn't fixing anything. She was studying us. By Wednesday, procurement forwarded a request from operations asking for emergency vendor benchmarks outside the normal cycle, framed as contingency planning. Perfectly reasonable, perfectly timed. She's building an alternative. Ethan said that night when we gathered. Something she can control, and something she can replace us with. Maribel added. We didn't speculate. We verified. Jonah pulled access logs. Ethan traced system mirrors. Maribel cross-checked vendor communications. Patterns formed quickly. Marianne wasn't trying to understand Orion. She was trying to own it. She's looking for a failure point she can name. Jonah said, something small enough to frame, big enough to justify intervention. And once she finds it, I said, she'll bring in a solution that answers only to her. Silence followed. Then Ethan spoke. She's not trying to fire us again, he said. She's trying to make us unnecessary. That was worse, because necessity is harder to defend than innocence. Thursday morning, Marianne requested a joint review session, just her and me. Neutral agenda, friendly tone. I agreed. Her office was immaculate. White surfaces, no personal photos, everything temporary. I want us aligned, she said. Pouring coffee I didn't drink. Monday was instructional. It was. I replied. She smiled thinly. I underestimated your team's influence, she said. But influence without structure is fragile. I waited. I'm proposing a parallel framework, she continued. External advisory support, redundancy. Really, insurance. You're planning to outsource judgment. I said. I'm planning to stabilize it, she corrected. People leave, vendors stay. There it was. Who are you considering? I asked. She slid a folder across the desk. A consulting firm I recognized immediately. Efficient, polished, obedient, and utterly blind to context. They'll operate alongside your team, she said. At first, I repeated. She met my gaze. This protects the company. No, it protected her. I'll review it, I said. She smiled again. I knew you would. That afternoon, the team reviewed the proposal in silence. She's creating a shadow system, Jonah said finally. One that reports upward, not outward. And when it fails, Maribel said, she'll say we blocked it. I nodded. Then we don't block it. I said, we let it run. They looked at me, and we document everything, because when someone builds a replacement without understanding the original, the failure isn't sudden, it's traceable, and Marianne was about to leave fingerprints everywhere. We didn't resist Marianne's proposal. That was the part she never anticipated. By Friday, the external consultants were onboarded polite, confident, armed with frameworks and slide decks that translated complexity into comforting boxes. They asked the right questions, just not the necessary ones. We gave them access, limited, logged, observed. Jonah set up parallel monitoring without announcing it. Ethan mapped decision divergence points where judgment mattered more than process. Maribel tracked client-facing shifts, the subtle tone changes that happened when relationships became tickets instead of conversations. To Marianne, it looked like cooperation. To us, it was exposure, within days. The differences became measurable. The consultants escalated everything. We filtered. They followed procedure. We followed patterns. They waited for approvals. We anticipated outcomes. Nothing failed outright, but friction increased response times stretched. Clients asked for clarifications they'd never needed before. Internal teams hesitated where they once moved instinctively. Marianne praised the consultants publicly. Structure creates stability, she said in a leadership meeting. Daniel said nothing. By the second week, the first crack appeared. A long-term client requested a minor deviation, nothing contractual. Just a timing adjustment rooted in years of mutual trust. The consultants declined. Correctly, according to policy, the client escalated. Maribel handled the call quietly, de-escalating, reassuring, but afterward, she forwarded me the message the client had sent. We don't feel heard anymore. That sentence went into the log. The next issue came from inside. An internal team delayed a launch decision, waiting for consultant sign-off. The delay triggered a cascade supplier rescheduling. Marketing confusion, missed alignment, still not a failure, just accumulation. Marianne remained confident. They're adjusting. She said to me one afternoon, change always feels uncomfortable before it works. I nodded. Of course. That night, Jonah sent the summary. Decision latency up 17%, escalation volume up 23%, client sentiment trending downward, all compared against our historical baseline. Not opinions, evidence. We didn't present it yet. We waited. Because Marianne wasn't done, by the third week, she requested expanded authority for the consultant's broader access, faster approvals, direct reporting lines. This will streamline everything, she told the board. Daniel asked one question. What happens to institutional memory? Marianne smiled. Memory is inefficient. Documentation replaces it. I watched the room carefully. No one agreed. No one objected. That was the moment. Because silence doesn't mean consent. It means calculation. That afternoon, the Orion system flagged a compound risk, small deviations converging. Nothing alarming, but recognizable. Jonah looked at me across the room. They don't see it, he said quietly. I know, I replied. And they won't, he added. Until it's undeniable. I closed my laptop. Then we don't interrupt. I said, we let the mirror finish forming, because Marianne believed structure could replace people, and she was about to learn the cost of that belief measured not in collapse, but in erosion, the kind no one notices until it's everywhere. The board meeting was scheduled for Thursday morning. Routine, quarterly, predictable. Marianne treated it like a victory lap. Her deck was clean charts trending gently upward. Operational flow diagrams smoothed into reassuring arrows. The consultants sat nearby, polished and confident, ready to speak the language of efficiency. I sat quietly. So did my team. The first half hour passed without friction. Metrics looked acceptable if you didn't know what had been removed to achieve them. Then Daniel asked for the risk summary. Marianne nodded, unfazed. Overall exposure is down, she said. Escalations are managed through standardized pathways. Decision authority is clear. Daniel turned to me. Elise, he said. Does your data agree? I stood. We tracked the same period. I said. But we measured something different. I connected my laptop. What you're seeing. I continued. Our outcomes. What we measured were signals. The screen filled with layered timelines, client response delays, internal hesitation points, decision loops that repeated instead of resolving. These aren't failures, I said. They're precursors. Marianne crossed her arms. You're interpreting noise. No, Jonah said calmly beside me. We're recognizing a pattern. I nodded. For 18 months, we contained risk before it reached awareness. I said, that containment wasn't procedural, it was relational. A board member leaned forward. Explain. Clients don't escalate when they feel understood. Teams don't hesitate when they trust judgment. Systems don't stall when someone recognizes drift early. I advanced the slide. Here's the same week. 2 years ago, I said. Similar volume, similar pressure, but zero accumulation. Marianne shook her head. That's correlation, not causation. Daniel spoke gently. Then answer this, he said. Why did 3 unrelated clients use the same phrase in escalation notes this week? The phrase appeared on screen. We don't feel heard. Silence followed. Marianne's expression tightened. That's subjective, she said. So is trust, Daniel replied. And trust is what keeps companies alive when systems fail. He turned to the consultants. Can your frameworks account for that? They hesitated. That hesitation was loud. Daniel leaned back. Marianne, he said, you weren't wrong to pursue structure, but you were wrong to believe it could replace judgment. She straightened. My mandate was efficiency, she said firmly, and I delivered it, at the cost of resilience. Daniel replied. He looked at the board. I propose we conclude the experiment. The consultants shifted uncomfortably. Effective immediately. Daniel continued. Strategic Operations Authority returns to Elise's team. External support transitions to advisory only. Marianne opened her mouth. And, he added, we begin a review of how restructuring decisions were made. That was the line she hadn't prepared for. Her eyes met mine. This wasn't about me winning. It was about the pattern finally being spoken aloud. Because systems don't fail from change. They fail when change ignores the people who sense collapse before it's visible. And now, everyone in the room could feel it. The room didn't erupt. There were no raised voices, no dramatic exits. Just a long, sobering quiet. Marianne gathered her papers slowly. The confidence she arrived with, finally gone, not shattered. Just irrelevant. She wasn't removed that day. That would have been too theatrical. Instead, authority shifted away from her in precise, documented steps, oversight committees, review processes. Decisions she once made alone now required visibility. Control doesn't vanish loudly. It thins in the weeks that followed. Averon stabilized not because something new was added, but because something essential was restored. My team returned to what they'd always done, noticing, adjusting, protecting. Orion launched cleanly. Clients stayed. Internal teams stopped hesitating. No one applauded. And that was the point. One afternoon, Daniel stopped by our workspace. No entourage, no agenda. You know, he said, looking around, most people try to prove their value by being seen. I smiled faintly. We prove it by making sure nothing breaks. He nodded. That's rarer than people think. Marianne resigned 2 months later. Quietly, officially for strategic misalignment. No scandal, no headline, just a line item in a quarterly update most people skipped. But her lesson stayed. Efficiency without understanding doesn't streamline it, strips. Structure without judgment doesn't stabilize it, freezes. And leadership that only sees cost will eventually lose value. It never knew how to measure. As for my team, we were finally named, not elevated, not glorified, just acknowledged. A permanent unit, trusted to operate between lines others never noticed. Sometimes the most powerful response to being underestimated isn't confrontation, it's clarity. Because when the noise clears, when the dashboards reset and the meetings end, what remains isn't who spoke the loudest. It's who kept everything standing while no one was looking. And that's a kind of visibility that never fades. I learned that real value doesn't shout, it works quietly until the moment it's needed most. This story reminded me that being underestimated isn't the end. Sometimes it's protection, giving you space to prove who you are through actions, not arguments. How did this story make you feel? Have you ever been in a moment where your worth was ignored or misunderstood? I'd love to hear your story. Where are you listening from today? If this resonated with you, leave a comment, give the video a like, share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe so we can keep these conversations going together. Conversations going together.